everybody to the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. We're delighted. This is a summer session, and most folks are out enjoying the rain on the beach. But some of us have come to hear Dr. Susan Stern, who is a visiting scholar from the University of Toronto. So Susan is somebody that I have known. I don't want to make us sound old, but for a few decades now here. She is somebody that was really well trained in parent and family level interventions, that has brought together kind of both the science base around supporting families as they rear their children, as well as kind of an advanced clinical practitioner. And so I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of two parts that Susan's really going to talk with us about evidence-informed practice, outcome studies about how we help children do well by supporting their parents and families. And so I think that you'll find Susan to be an amazingly engaging teacher, a lecturer, and I think she's really looking forward to a dialogue with all of you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan, get a sandwich, and welcome you all to McSilver.
Thank you.
Welcome, Susan.
So thank you not only for that lovely introduction and leading out exactly how many decades, but for all you've done to facilitate my visit here and my work here. And I'd just like to take a second now, in case I forget later, to also thank all of my colleagues at McSilver. My welcome has been so warm and generous. It's truly a privilege to be here. And even though she can't be here today, I also want to thank Dean Lynn Fedaica from Silver School of Social Work, who supported my coming as a visiting scholar here. So, and then thank all of you for being here. So I am an academic, and so I have a lot of slides, and I might speak a little bit too academic, so I'm going to try to stop and slow down and have some conversation as we go along. But I'm really going to talk about a couple different studies. And what I want to do is put it in the context of children's mental health and wellness and the key role of parenting, and then use illustrations from two studies that I've been involved in, not to tell you all about the research and the methodology, but to really highlight some of the issues as we take these evidence-based parenting and family strengthening interventions out to the community, to the real world, okay? And so you're going to get snapshots of them. And the programs, they're two different evidence-based parenting programs, and they're two different contexts and populations. So one's a universal prevention program in Toronto, and one is with a high-risk population in an Aboriginal community in Northern Ontario. So let me just get like maybe a little hand wave if you're familiar with either of these programs. One is the Incredible Years Parenting Program. Great. And the other is the Group Triple P Positive Parenting Program. Okay. So, you get to go then. You're familiar? You're going to go up in the rank. Okay. So I also want to say, before I get into the studies, that you often get these presentations from the perspective of the folks who developed the programs. They're talking about their issues around dissemination, they're purveyors, they're trying to get communities to adapt the programs. I'm doing it from the perspective of not trying to interest you in either of these programs. I'm not affiliated with either of these programs, but really give you sort of a ground view of real world implementation through my partnership with these agencies, okay? So to give you a context, and a lot of you will know most of this, but the prevalence of child mental health and work disorders has been estimated at 17 to 26%. And the statistics are a little bit variable worldwide. They're 7 to 22%. It depends what study you read. But it's a really alarming statistic worldwide, since in developing countries, 30 to 50% of their population is under 18. Okay? So as we go along, I'll give you a little Canadian flavor, because my colleagues keep asking me about Canada. So the statistics in Canada are 14 to 25% of Canadian children, and the rates are even greater in disadvantaged families. Rates are as high as 40%. Okay, 1 in 4 young Canadian children has behavioral and learning difficulties. 1 in 5 has a diagnosable mental health problem. And you can see what that translates to in Ontario, which has Toronto, one of the largest urban cities in the country. And conduct disorder is one of the most common disorders and reasons for referral. Worldwide, conduct disorder in Western countries where we have the data is about 5 to 10%. And most of these evidence-based parenting programs were originally developed for children with aggression, with conduct problems, even though many of them have been developed and are addressing other issues as well. But I'm going to focus, and the work I've been doing is around primarily children with conduct problems. But of course, we know that those are comorbid, or they co-occur with other problems, both disruptive behavior problems like ODD or ADHD, but also emotional problems like depression and anxiety. And this is a spectrum of problems that many of which could be preventable, okay? And so the risks for young children, it starts them on a negative trajectory that has implications across the life course. Can everyone read this? Because I don't feel the need to, it looks like a really big screen, okay? So, you know, across the life course, this really limits their opportunities for their own personal growth, for their academic learning, for their careers, for them participating in society. At adolescence, we see that child conduct problems is related to a host of adolescent social problems, and these have physical health consequences. So sexually risky behavior, unintentional injury or accident. I think 70% of premature deaths are related to behavior patterns that begin in adolescence. Okay? So clearly an early history of conduct problems has profound negative consequences both for the individual child or youth, the family, and society as a whole. Okay? Children with conduct problems consume the most resources and are the most expensive to serve. So again, this is Canadian data. For those youth who do go on to become serious offenders, the costs are approximately $100,000 a year in a facility, juvenile detention facility. And youth, once they're in juvenile justice facilities, are a group at high risk because there's high levels of mental health disorder in juvenile justice, as we know, and very scarce therapeutic interventions. So, why parenting programs? Well, the majority of these chronic behavior problems in school-age children have an early onset. And it's the children, the youth with early onset that are most at risk, and typically without intervention, these problems intensify as one goes on in school and through your life course. And parenting matters. So again, this is no surprise, so I feel a little bit like I'm talking to the converted. But just want to acknowledge a few things. So we know the roots of conduct problems and other mental health disorders are multiple. So I don't want to sort of simplify things. But parenting and family function plays a key role in both healthy and problematic child functioning. And parent-child interaction is a key risk factor for early onset conduct problems. So strained relationships, poor supervision and monitoring, ineffective discipline practices, inconsistent, harsh, coercive, or lax, but again, these have some cultural context. In another study I've been involved in, the Rochester Youth Development Study, what might be considered harsh, as long as it was non-abusive, was actually protected for African American families in urban high-crime neighborhoods. So again, we have to look at this in a little bit of nuanced way. Poor parent emotional regulation. Young children have difficulty regulating when their parents don't. Okay? And parenting has both these direct effects but also indirect effects. So when low supervision and monitoring increases risk of associating with kids who get in trouble, we talk about deviant peers. So the indirect effects, for example, deviant peers is the strongest proximal factor right next or preceding juvenile delinquency. So the important piece of this is we've had parenting intervention programs for a while. We know that many of them have impacts and outcome, but we now have the science that says that it's the actual shifts in the parenting that produces the improvement in child aggression. When I last actually reviewed the literature thoroughly, that was about 2 years ago, there were at least 6 experimental studies that had a causal link. I'm sure that there are more now. Okay. So, before I go to the parenting programs, I always have to put a caveat in, because I think we can really inadvertently end up blaming parents when we start talking about the risk factors, right? Then we refer them to parenting programs, and we know that one of the important things that we need to do is to help decrease blame, and parents blame themselves enough, society does, particularly moms still. So recognizing that many of these families are parenting under stress, and we know that a whole host of ecological factors disrupt parenting and family relationships. Again, it's some prior work I've done, but wonderful colleagues like Rand Conger and Gerald Patterson in this group have looked at the impact of how, for example, poverty or economic loss or multiple stresses impacts kids through disrupting parenting, marital relationships, through parental depression, which I like to call parent stress. I hate to label a whole population of folks who are poor experiencing stress as depressed on some of these are not clinical measures usually. So that the interactive multiple stresses often occur in the context of limited resources and social isolation, and you're all familiar with those. And particularly in trauma in particular populations, for example, refugee families, returning veterans. Okay? So, to go back to how parenting sort of leads into these parenting programs is we have strong evidence for these parenting programs, and that parenting and family-centered interventions are at the heart of effective practice and of facilitating healthy children, healthy family, healthy communities. And so I just put some references up. The slides will be posted. The first two are systematic reviews. The third is actually one of my own chapters. But parent training is the single most empirically supported approach for children's disruptive behaviors. Sorry, I'm not so good at this. There we go, okay. And so if we looked at these evidence-based family and parenting interventions, what they do is they strengthen parent skills and the parent-child relationship, and they modify coercive interactions in the family. And I keep on sort of emphasizing that because sometimes we think of these about discipline programs, or you think behavior modification, and thinking like 20 years ago that this is all about rules and discipline. It's really about providing nurturing, safe, stable, predictable environments for kids. And as a matter of fact, the World Health Organization, in a recent report on evidence-based programs for violence prevention, identifying parenting to develop those relationships as one of the key programs for violence prevention. Okay? Evidence-based interventions are ecological and multi-component, so they focus on parenting and context, the stressors on parenting, on kids in context, other impacts like peers, and multi-component research-based parenting and family prevention. So the first part is intervention. Prevention is also stronger when they're family-based, and they're more durable than those focused solely on children. Okay? Yet, only a small percentage of families actually receive these programs, and they're not readily available or used. So, make evidence-based programming more accessible and available. So, I'm sorry. I'm having trouble with my eyes here. Increase awareness and availability of evidence-based parenting supports. I'm a co-investigator on a Canadian-wide study across all the provinces looking at parents' awareness of programs, how available they are in their community. I'm going to refer to it a little bit later again. About half of the Canadian parents have heard of one of these evidence-based parenting groups, haven't. Okay? And again, I don't know what that would be like here, and in the U.S. you'd have to probably go community to community and state to state. Universal prevention, there's a compelling argument for potential benefits, including an entry point for high-risk families. So we could really debate, is it better to sort of target high-risk families, or do we offer it to everyone? We certainly get stronger effect sizes in studies when they're high-risk families, but we can really sort of interrupt negative trajectories, decrease stigma with universal prevention, and change the prevalence of risky parenting practices and increase protective ones at a societal level. So Peter and I were talking a little bit this morning, also going back a few decades, about, about looking at cognitive behavioral therapy, what's happened in the last 20 years. If I look at parenting programs and what's happened in 20 years, a very smart colleague of mine, Tony Diglin in Oregon, was writing about 20 years ago about how we had the science and the knowledge to actually change parenting in the same way that public health campaigns are beginning to decrease smoking. And you know what? Now we're really beginning to do that, okay? There was a study of PPP, one of the programs that reduced the incidence of child abuse sort of at a population level in a state. So we don't have many studies yet like that, but we have the knowledge to begin to do that, okay? Ensure parenting programs are culturally responsive, and we're going to look at that as I go through the studies, and remove barriers to access and engagement, and that will be part 2, sort of a little bit backwards. We're going to look at the engagement studies I've done next time, and we're going to look more at fidelity, implementation, and the culturally and contextually responsiveness this time. So, I'm just going to put these all up there because you folks know this and I want to go to the studies. But the prevention agenda, the prevention and treatment of child mental health problem has been defined internationally by governments, United Nations, World Health Organization. England has a parenting academy where they've looked at evidence-based interventions. Glasgow, I was there last year. The whole city is doing population health parenting, really recognizing the impact of parenting programs. And those of you at McSilver will be familiar from some of Mary McKay's research on engagement with some of these pieces. But in the international parenting survey we're doing in Canada, low-income parents are more likely to seek consultation for child problems, often with pediatricians. It was the #1 before social workers. So they have the need, but they're less aware of services, which is our reach, and they face more obstacles. So this doesn't surprise anyone. So we really need to bridge the gap between science and real-world implementation of these programs, and can certainly do better than we're doing. So I have an honorable mention over there because in our professions we're all trying, right? But it would be really nice if in the next decade we got So the first illustration, this is old, but I love Dean Fixon's quote, is implementing incredible years. Now, this particular agency, Child Development Institute, had funding from the ministry in Ontario to implement this across early learning centers that they ran in collaboration with community agencies. The program was starting in January. The group leaders had already been hired and trained by the folk at the University of Washington, where Incredible Year originates. I had dinner with the director of the agency. I was introduced to him in November. We had a nice talk, and he said, I'd love you to do some research with us. And, you know, it's November. I'm American. I live in Canada, but I come here for Thanksgiving, then we have Christmas. There's no time to write a grant, get funding for any of this. It's starting in January. So this is truly the agency folks. Did the, the training occur, the supervision occurred at the agency level. I just came in and kind of did some evaluation with them. And you'll see that it's an implementation study. We have a little bit of parent data, but not a lot, because we neither had funding or ethics approval for parents in the beginning, okay? So, to just give you a little bit of an overview of the study, early learning centers are like daycare centers, right? They did 29 parenting groups over a 3-year period. So, 3 times a year, winter, summer, fall, or spring, fall, I don't remember exactly how to do that. There would be 3 or 4 groups at different early learning centers, and that went on, okay? Really looking at treatment fidelity. So Ted Taylor, who was one of the trainers of Incredible Years, when he came in to do one of the trainings, we had a nice talk. I had known him from a couple of decades back. And I said, I've been invited to do research. These programs are starting. What are you doing there? What do you think will be really most useful? He he said nobody yet has studied fidelity prospectively rather than interview people afterwards. He said if you can find any ways to track it, so really about how you take this evidence-based intervention to community practice in a manner that's consistent with the protocols that was developed. And so we wanted to understand the barriers and facilitators. And so I did a mixed methods prospective study, and we used quantitative session checklists and observer rating scales that we modified. They were based on Carolyn Webster Strandon sharing the material she had at the time. But we also wanted to hear the voices of the group leaders and the supervisors and the parents through them. So the written narratives is they didn't do anything for the research. It's just when the supervisor did her independent observations, she took supervision notes. So we coded all of those. When the group leaders all met together for sort of joint problem solving and supervision, we taped and transcribed it and coded it. We asked them on their session checklist that they finished after every time they did a group to write out any gems and departures that happened, because we really wanted to bring them on as skilled, knowledgeable practitioners using their clinical judgment as partners in the research, that maybe there were reasons to modify and not to implement exactly as intended. Toronto, according to the United Nations, is the most multicultural city in the world. I don't know. New York is pretty multicultural, and so is a whole lot of other cities. But nevertheless, we didn't know really how it was going to transport to Canada. Okay? So really study the implementation process as it unfolded, which was really difficult for me because I've done so much supervision and training, and I could only sort of observe. I couldn't jump in and sort of start supervising them because that wasn't the purpose. And then at the end, we did a retrospective group leaders focus group because the group leaders had run several groups. So what we wanted to do is now say, reflect on your experience over running these different groups. And then, of course, we go to those. So you all know why fidelity is important. And so really it's that balance between fidelity and local adaptation, because there is research across adult and child studies that when you begin to modify these interventions, effectiveness can be compromised. But there are significant challenges to implementing these in communities, and one of the really important things is to identify the critical supports. I think we know more about them than we did 10 years ago, including a lot more about the organizational supports. But it's also important to understand the reasons for departures rather than say you didn't implement with fidelity. And as a matter of fact, true rigorous fidelity, for example, to manuals, has been shown to potentially compromise the relationship. Practitioners don't like it. So folks now are using the term that I'm not sure, I think maybe Ellen has the term flexibility within fidelity. But we need to know really what can we modify? What are the core components? Do we know the causal mechanisms, which we do know a little bit from parenting? And then, of course, the modifications require rigorous evaluation themselves. So not too many of you knew the Incredible Years model, but it really emphasizes building positive parent-child interactions. Parent self-efficacy, their coping, their problem-solving skills. It's strengths-based, learning through modeling and practice, so it's very action-oriented, creating support networks. But I really want to emphasize sort of the flexible and collaborative. Some of the materials that support the fidelity. Fidelity is a comprehensive book Carolyn Webster Strandon has written in pretty clear, straightforward language that talks about the processes. So it's not just the content or the techniques, it's those good group skills, collaborative skills, how you work with parents, and we'll see what happens to that in sort of our findings. And tailor it to each child's temperament and family situation, even in a group setting. And led by skilled and knowledgeable leaders that are trained, but who know something about child development, family dynamics. And so fidelity is supported by the intensive training. There is a manual. There are videotape vignettes. And they're not the perfect way. They just show different ways of handling these situations for discussion, because it's more about coping than mastery, because it never, how many of your parents? It never goes like you see on the tapes or in the books. So it's the coping. Okay. And again, I'm not trying to sell the program. You'll have this on the transparencies, but it's just to give you a sense that the program itself has good evidence. And what's important for both the effectiveness of prevention studies is that there are independent replications. It's not just done by the folks who developed it, okay? And that the follow-ups have been 3 to 10 years. This is across studies. I went and looked. And maintenance is high, okay? And I can make a whole list, you know, all these countries now have these lists of evidence-based programs. I just went through it. We had 18 different group leaders. They called it groups, so in various combinations. They were ethnically and linguistically diverse. They spoke Spanish, Cantonese, Farsi. 2 of the groups we had to get interpreters for were Tamil groups. Most of the groups were not homogeneous except for the Tamil, but it reflected the diversity of Toronto and the particular neighborhood where the early learning center was. And for the 2 rounds where we did get ethics approval to look at parents and look at outcome data, you can get a little sense of, like most of these studies, primarily mothers, right? Children were young, they're early learning centers, approximately half of the parents were on social assistance. And what's really important is English was only the first language, or another way is 40% English was not the first language. And that also comes out. So you're going to have to trust me that we use good methodology and measures, and we're going to skip straight to the findings. Okay. So the session-by-session checklist was self-report. And that was after every session, you check off yes, no. These are Carolyn Webster Strandon's measures, whether you did particular things. And besides the sort of overall adherence, there are components. And so this is just a snapshot of all the findings. When I say grand mean, it's across all the groups, across all the years. So you can see that it's close to 84%, which is pretty high. And I broke out role play and vignettes because these are the 2 areas that I had concern on. And you can see overall that those were much lower. Okay, that was the number of the required role plays and the number of the core vignettes that were shown. The group leader rating scale is both about the structure, but it's all about the process. And I'm going to show you another chart that breaks it down a little bit more. But it's a 5-point scale. Again, you can see it's quite high overall, with practice and role plays being a little bit lower. And the quotes on the bottom are about role plays and vignettes, but we're going to see them bigger in a little while. It's just in sort of an iterative fashion, we went back and forth between the qualitative and quantitative data, and the same things that are lower in the quantitative data emerged as barriers in the qualitative data. So just for those of you who are numbers people, the overall adherence, this is year 1. Year 2 and 3 we combined because there were fewer groups in year 3 and overall. And you can see that overall adherence, fidelity, was strong across the years. But if you look at core vignettes and role play, you can see that they are lower across the years, but they go up. Can folks see? Not my pointing. They do improve from first year to second and third year. Okay, and of course the supervisor was giving them feedback on it. And the number of sessions role play was used versus the number of role plays, and the sessions, any vignettes were shown. The vignettes is better. It's more a dosage issue. Is there a core vignettes and optional vignettes? And the group leaders often didn't show the core ones if an optional one seemed to fit the families better. And personally, I think that's a great adaptation because some of the issues were things like not enough single parents, not enough fathers. But again, role play went up, but is still lower. And practice and role plays, this is observer. So in the first year, even when there was an observer rating, some folks didn't do the role plays. So again, you hear a pattern here that I'm concerned about. But overall, the ratings are quite high in terms of the collaborative group process and leadership skills. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm going to highlight particular ones, but you will have them in that 12 barriers, themes came out about barriers to protocol adherence. The ones in red I've mentioned, and we're going to go look at a little bit more closely. And the ones at the bottom did not come out sort of in an ongoing fashion, but they came out in the focus group at the end, the cultural, the balancing parents' needs, and the organization. So if we look at the balancing parenting preferences, there was a tension between the collaborative and the expert role. So the group leaders really struggled to fit in the content while fully engaging the parents, and parents discussed preferred discussion. And they wanted to keep parent involvement high. They were also uncomfortable with strange activities like the role playing. And it wasn't just the parents, it was also the leaders. And there was a cultural preference for a learning style, sort of more lecture education came out in the focus group. And that had to do, for example, a lot of Southeast Asian families, teacher is expert, gives out advice. However, we know from other research on the process of these evidence-based parenting programs that teach behaviors increase, quote, resistance, I don't like that word, but the parents are more likely to drop out when you teach them, these sort of educational, versus a lot of support and reframing. So we see sort of this culture interacting with what we know is good process, okay? So just a few quotes. So the role play discomfort, we tried to get more at what was getting in the way, anxiety, subconsciousness, childness, again, preferred discussion. But when we get to the systematic review of effective parenting programs and what are the components that have the impact, what are core components, performance-based methods, including role-playing, is one of them. So again, that's why I keep emphasizing that Carolyn Webster Stratton has written about it. You have to sort of bring group leaders along, encourage them. But they role-play in training, they're encouraged. My question really is about sustainability. I mean, this was just what's happening in the agency. Like, you know, if they're not role-playing practicing with parents, are we getting the impact if we were doing an outcome study? Okay, so that's an implementation issue. The vignettes, they didn't find some of the vignettes relevant. They liked the vignettes, and you're going to see this in the second study I talk about also, about whether it actually reflected their experience. Okay? And again, this is important because Incredible Years research, they themselves have a study that shows that videotape vignettes with group leader input has significantly better impact, so this was an outcome study, than the groups that had discussion without the vignettes. So folks like discussion groups, but we don't have a lot of evidence that they impact anything, okay? And the bottom quote I liked, the vignettes didn't match the teaching points of the topics. That's a facilitator group leader quote. For example, timeout should be used as a last resort, yet vignettes show minor things to be timed out, like not hanging up a coat. That's important because that's where the clinical judgment comes in. Do you understand that this is timeout from attention that's maintaining behaviors? What's the use of timeout? Because that's how you modify and fit it to families when you understand it a little bit. And lastly, culture. As I said, culture did not come out as a barrier to implementation. We thought it might, other than in the focus group when our group leaders, looking back, told us about some of their struggles with certain cultures around sort of teaching. But it came out, but it was off to a very enriching discussion. So you can see on this baking discussion, okay? And that's the true intent, and I do give credit to Carolyn Webster Stratton in terms of her writing about the collaborative facilitative. On her website, you can watch her leading groups about how she brings people in with different backgrounds. It doesn't have to be culture. I mean, you could be in the same culture and have different beliefs, right? Language. English as a second language was much more a barrier. It takes more time to express yourself in a second language, translation time, how many idioms we have in our language, difficulty sometimes in understanding video vignettes, doing written homework. So there were lots of adaptations, and I have pages of how my group leaders did adaptations, and we coded and reviewed them all, and it was really felt like they were adhering to the core components and fitting into the family without deviating. Things even like role plays, instead of role playing in front of the whole group, breaking up in pairs. Things that didn't seem to compromise effectiveness from our perspective. But ESL issues definitely took precedence over cultural differences, which has implications too. Just because it's session 1, session 2, session 3, there's no reason that we have to do parenting groups like that. Okay. So to just take a minute to talk about facilitators. The facilitators were primarily in 3 categories, related to really supervision, and that was a real core theme. Related to group leader characteristics and their beliefs, and related to the structure of the materials, the manuals, the vignettes, all of that sort of helps. But what we saw is that the group leaders and the supervisor did a number of steps. So they highlighted and reinforced fidelity. So in the group leader supervision, the supervisor would validate what they had said and the challenges, provide sort of a rationale, then collaborate rather than say this is really important, you need to do it, and then problem solve how to overcome the barrier in the group, focusing on the goal of what needed to happen in the group. We saw the group leaders in the narratives we coded doing the same thing with the parents. Okay? And the supervisor responsiveness even went to things like concrete resources. If you're really busy, you may not have time to Xerox all the materials, you know? It's how do you support workers to do this when they're running from one thing to another? Okay? So this is just some of the group leaders mirroring the supervisor. So what I'd say about that is they really got it. And our therapists really believed in the importance of the program's core components and collaborative process. And fidelity may be enhanced when clinicians think that this program is relevant and works for the populations that they're working with. A lot of emphasis on accountability and ongoing session monitoring. In the first year out of 12, I can't remember, but 200 something checklists that we were supposed to have. We were only missing 2, and one was because the group was canceled. It was a snowy night. So they really had a sense of ownership and responsibility themselves for quality control. We didn't put anything on that the agency wouldn't be using. We just had them send it to us and code it. And then a supervisor, and this is an issue, I've done some training with Triple P folks, where the supervisors themselves didn't go through the training. So the supervisors need to understand the evidence-based programs they're supervising. And then the organizational piece did come out a lot, that the child care organizations that bought in, were on board, had good relationships with the Child Mental Health Center and with the parents, had a relationship both to fidelity and to parents showing up. So I just want to acknowledge my colleagues. The first year data is published, our third year data will submitted soon. So before I quickly move on to a second study, comments, questions, thoughts? Yeah, Diane?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Susan. One thought or question about the role plays. Were those canned role plays that were presented to them, or did that generate out of their own experience? So they would come in with a scenario that might have happened at home and role play it?
The role plays were more like we're role playing the skill, what's your scenario?
So they would supply the scenarios?
Yes. And we did also things like role play a success story to break them in, you know, but yes. That's a great question, and a really important one, right? So, am I going, can I keep going? So the second illustration is group Triple P. And you're going to see it's going to bring out some more issues, but really redundant in issues in some ways. And then hopefully there will be like 5 minutes at the end that I can pull them all together. This is adapted from a presentation we did in Scotland. And Carolyn Holding, who just this week graduated, the doctoral student. I was the research consultant on the grant. This is her research, so I presented with her permission and I adapted her. But Aboriginal communities in Canada probably like most Aboriginal communities, are at increased risk of a broad range of poor outcomes. Off-reserve Aboriginal children, 40% live in poverty. Read it. Close to 100 First Nations must boil their water. I mean, the situation is really very pitiful. Almost half of Aboriginal children and 15-year-old living in urban areas, living a single parent. And the context is that these vulnerabilities developed in the context of cultural destruction associated with colonization, including residential schools. So residential schools was, in the 19th century, white folks came to the country, aggressive assimilation, we have to take these kids and we have to teach them how to be proper citizens. And when I say aggressive things, like if they spoke in their native language and they were caught, they were severely punished. So we know the whole story, unfortunately, is sexual abuse. High, I'm not sure why there are plus signs there, but high mortality. I was mortified to find out that these schools had burial grounds on the school's grounds. These kids weren't used to the diet they were fed. And I was also mortified to find out from one of my First Nations colleagues that the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. So they're at an increased risk of a broad array of problems. And I know you can't read them, so all you need to do is look at the yellow bars. So for whether it's externalizing or internalizing, we can just see the yellow bars for Aboriginal children is much higher. And the last bar is for any of these problems, and 50% of Aboriginal children are at risk and much higher than the population. Okay? So I'm going to show you on a map where it looks like, but in Northern Ontario, the directors of the child mental health centers were very concerned, the band leaders are very concerned about children's child mental health, and decided that parenting and parenting programs were a priority, and they decided to adopt Triple P. So I'm not going to go through all the background, but all of this is done with band council approval, with special ethics that I'm sure you do here that we have to go through on grants when we're working with Aboriginal. In Canada, Aboriginal includes First Nations, Métis, there are a number of different categories, not tribes or communities, because there's about, I don't remember, but about 400 of those. Okay? So again, it's caring relationships, strategies to increase appropriate behaviors, to reduce problem behaviors, and to do so developmentally appropriately, not coercively. Big emphasis on self-regulation in parents and self-reflection. So using these strategies, reflecting on what worked, what didn't, evaluating themselves against the criteria. And again, we have the active learning strategies. Again, there are DVDs. Okay. And again, I'm just putting the research in brief. The first one's a systematic review. It's been used, again, 34, I can't remember how many countries, but it's used in a lot of other countries. I'm not here to sell Triple P, so I didn't look it all up. But there's also evidence for good outcomes with Indigenous families in Australia. Okay? But parenting programs don't always translate. And it may be due to cultural differences in perceptions of the value or the relevance in terms of these communities and how they engage with you. We found that a little bit in the Jamaican Canadian community that I'll talk about in 2 weeks in Toronto in terms of engagement. So the impetus, this was the impetus for this study, and we wanted to do some pre-post measures, some slight outcome measures, but as a first step, decided that qualitative methods may be more congruent with sort of Aboriginal worldviews and give us some rich understanding. So our next step is to go look at treatment outcome. So there is the Indigenous Australian Triple P version, and it has similar content to the regular Triple P version, but there are changes to the resource images and materials. But it features actors, etc., specific to Indigenous parents in Australia. So again, we find this relates to our findings. So our research questions: was it helpful? Were there changes according to Parent and Group Leader report? And was it consistent with the values of Aboriginal parents again? Okay. So the participants were all from one city and 2 towns in northwestern Ontario, which is right above that cross line. This was with 11 parents, again mostly moms. They all identified as Aboriginal Canadian. The parent participants had all completed a group triple P parenting program. These were run by agencies. Again, we had nothing to do with it. We just came in and talked to them. There were 8 facilitators from the mental health agency. They were experienced. They had run 2 to 10 triple P groups. Half of them identified as Aboriginal. They were all accredited. They had gone through triple P training and had accreditation. And supervision was provided by managers committed to implementing the program with fidelity to its design. So again, we saw that in the incredible years, the real commitment and understanding of the supervisor. But when you start doing intervention in clinical practice, it doesn't always work the way it does in research. So there was some session format variability. I think triple P group is like 8 group sessions, 2 home visits. So I think one had 6 group sessions, 2 home visits and phone calls. One did 3 back-to-back days that were longer with 2 home visits. They all had home visits to individualize. There was variabilities in use of incentives for attendance. For the research, we paid them $20 and had a community, for the qualitative interviews, had a community dinner. But some group leaders used seasonal clothing, used different incentives. But more importantly, there was variability in the use of the Indigenous resources because the Indigenous workbooks didn't arrive on time for most of them. So some of the groups had regular DVDs and workbooks, some had Indigenous, some had a choice when they came, and so we asked them about the usefulness of them. So I'm going to give you some bottom lines and then again show you a few of the quotes. So helpfulness. There were reported improvements in parenting skills, child behaviors and competency, and parent-child relationships. The participants received the strategies were consistent with the parents' values, and I'm going to show you a few quotes because the findings were unexpected. We did not expect them to be as powerful as they were, okay? The role plays, the Indigenous workbooks were particularly good fit. They love the role plays. So if you think about the storytelling tradition, there was a real impact. We didn't have the same issues around the role plays. Or videos. Hey, that's kind of like me in a way, okay? Behavioral monitoring was very unfamiliar to them to track progress. It was a challenge, but they found it valuable. And self-regulation, this is a group leader that was never part of any other program that I've run. But the parents are really tuning in to how did that work, how do they do, they're evaluating themselves. Another group leader said, I know in behavioral programs you're supposed to teach folks that and we're supposed to do it, but never knew how to do it in a way that was natural and worked. Okay. So this is whether it's helpful from parents' perspective. Changes in families' overall functioning, mental health. Might be considered helpful because it can encourage a sense of optimism. So hope, because there's such hopelessness on some of these reserves, okay? Seem to compare well. These group leaders loved Triple P, but the Credible Years leaders loved Incredible Years. So personally, I think it's less about the program, but about the collaborative nature and whether you're giving people manuals and say you have to do it this way or how you partner with them. Okay, how parenting changed, the idea of just sitting and listening to your kids, being more positive. Introducing new strategies for discipline. I'm really designed for set. I can't use circumstances, like elders yelling at me, so yeah, okay, I have to use my calm voice, I just have to keep reminding myself. So their elders were the ones that were taking the residential treatment schools, and when they came back to the reserves, there were disrupted attachment relationships. So it's really very powerful. Only way my mom knew how and how she taught me is to hit. So, it seems like the cycle is broken. Now, again, I don't think this is a panacea. We are going to talk about it, but clearly promising. Routine, bringing structure, child's activities, because the whole community is these kids, parents, grandparents, etc. So there's often not structure when they go from one place to another. Yeah.
What about sustainability? Can you address that? So you do this program, And, you know, I think we all really have a lot of respect for it. So what remains there for them to have this continuity?
That's a great question. Would you mind if I hold it for just about 4 minutes?
No problem.
And come back, because
No
I think it's a question for all the programs? Is that okay? So improvement in competencies and behaviors, and strong parent, strong child, I like it, made the daughter stronger, more confident, but the parents are noticing these things, okay? The cultural resonance. You're thinking it's going to be sustainable, but it's still a great question, right? And this was really my favorite, that it wasn't experienced as foreign to them. It didn't come from our culture, you know. My mom and them, before they went to boarding school, there was no such thing as him. It was a general way of discipline. When they went to the boarding school, that's where they learned to have their kids. So now they're teaching us is the parenting to go back where it was before, the way it's supposed to be. So they're telling us something about their traditions, their culture, I can include myself, I'm not necessarily including you, but you know, what white persons who are not the First Nations came and did to them, and that this helps them get back to it, that this is not the way that they want to be with their kids. And the role playing, the visual learners, it was very compelling to them. The Indigenous workbooks were perceived as an improvement, but the Indigenous DVDs were a more mixed response, because not only do the Australian Indigenous folks not necessarily look like them, but they don't all look like one another from one community to another. So basically they say, you need to see a few people that need to look like us, not everyone. And this is kind of consistent with some work a colleague at the Prevention Research Center, I think in Arizona, is doing with substance abuse prevention, with Latino, African American kids. You don't need to have a Latino version, an African American. You just need to be able to relate to someone that looks like you. So they're saying what would be more consistent with the experience of Aboriginal families is see some folks on the reserve, see extended families, you know, it would have been good for the grandparents, even the aunties and uncles, okay, enhance the relevance, okay. So the take-home message is that Group Triple P can be beneficial even in the context of the grave adversity experienced by Aboriginal people. It was helpful in introducing new ideas and refining skills in a compelling manner, because you can build on the strengths and supports that these folks are telling us that they had somewhere. Improvements in parenting and child behaviors reported, not only consistent with the values and strategies, but perhaps more consistent than some frequently used parenting practices before European colonizers. They talked about the 7 principles of the Anishinaabe, things like praise, similar to honor, recognizing and honoring accomplishments. Time out in a way was similar to sort of shunning traditions. And then it's probably worth continuing to invest in research, both evaluating the program and enhancing effectiveness. So again, I just want to put the acknowledgements out there. So what do you all think about the sustainability question before I respond? Because I think it's the same question for any of these programs, right?
Yes, yes.
Well, I think that the mention of the cycle breaking, I think even apart from the intervention itself, like the tangible curriculum or whatever the intervention might be, I think speaks to some sort of sustainability, because you are kind of, in a sense, breaking that cycle and allowing future generations to carry on these new behaviors. So I think in that way, it's apart from whether or not they're doing the actual curriculum, it's sustainable somewhat in that way.
Thank you. Okay, great. And let's hope so, that some of these kids will have different experiences. So one of the things is that you just can't go as a practitioner or a researcher into these communities and say, I want to do stuff, right? So the mental health center directors all got together, but then they all met with the chiefs of bunch. You have to have commitment. You know, the same thing, Brenda Bree, and I can't remember who she wrote it with a book on, she's in New Jersey, it wasn't book, it was African American families in New Jersey and New York, has a fabulous book on these programs also, about going into the communities, volunteering in politics, going to church. Like, if you really want sustainability, you just can't go in, do something, and come back out. And of course, there is the funding issues. But, you know, we have stuff which I'm going to get to in a moment here, like the Community Collaborative Board. You have people from the community. They adopted Triple P. They could have adopted, the advantage of Triple P is it's a population health program, which we're going to look at. But they could have adopted any program. The question is the commitment. Have they trained up enough people as there's turnover in agencies? You know, what's the plan for keeping people trained, for keeping it relevant, for having a continuous quality feedback loop of getting information, of making sure it is making a difference? So, you know, I think there are a number of pieces to that, probably many more than I'm mentioning. And the foul.
I continuously struggle with this issue, and you know, we get funding and then we lose our funding, and then yes, there are community and leaders and spiritual leaders and cultural leaders, but I'm not so optimistic because one person, you know, had a thought that it's, you know, long-lasting because patterns of behavior are tough to break. So.
Yeah, I think the person I think you're thinking about was Nancy Boyd Franklin.
Yes, thank you, thank you.
And I think what they did was they basically developed competent communities so
Yes.
that they transferred the power and the sustainability of the intervention to the people who had the most at stake, the people in the communities. And they build sustainability on that level, because you're right, funding comes, funding goes, professionals who are running these programs aren't always available and may not be available in the future.
That's right.
And so the only way you can really build sustainability into it is to get the community that is going to benefit the most from this intervention to buy into it.
And I think you need to plan for sustainability at the very beginning, not at the very end.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We don't do that often enough. I am encouraged that these are not just studies by the developers anymore, but, you know, that we're beginning to see proliferation. And I also think about what's our alternative. Using programs that either we know are ineffective, of which there are some, or programs that we have no reason to believe are effective. And in child mental health and some of the studies of treatment as usual, we know that despite our very best efforts and good heart, they're not necessarily working. They're not necessarily based on the best available science. I always use the example with my students of young aggressive kids, boys, when they're working on self-esteem, of sending them to read research studies that they don't have low self-esteem and they're not targeting the right risk of protective factors. So, you know, I don't think these are panaceas, but I think it's our best bet is to do things that have shown maintenance, that we need to continually improve, continually evaluate, continually build. Now, of course, they're least likely to work with some of our most distressed families, and it's not necessarily that if they get in and stay in, particularly when you have home visits or you individualize and tailor. We know some of these parenting programs not only change child behavior, but parent depression, parent stress, but the engagement and keeping folks in. So there was another quote somewhere about, you know, there are the limitations. What about someone who doesn't have water or a roof over their head or something happened? You know, they're not going to come to a parenting group. So I think in all of these evidence-based programs, the issues of the most stressed families, again, Incredible Years, I think, has some of the better research really right now on keeping engagement rates high with disadvantaged families. I think that's a struggle for Triple P when I hear it from my Australian colleagues, the social workers in Australia. But I think a number of us who are doing the work outside of Australia are not invested in, you know, the sort of the program. Well, I should say that, because Matt Sanders is very invested and cares a great deal. But I think some of us are bringing other pieces to it, and it's not going to happen overnight. But your question is, I think there are two key questions: the sustainability, and both for the families and the communities, and the implementation and bridging the gap in terms of the uptake and how agencies as well as our communities.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think you need to give some thought to as we kind of go through the next several years, is that we're more and more being stretched in terms of resources and the ability to sustain these programs and communities because of those resources. And again, going back almost decades to think about some of the stuff that I learned in community organizing at Rutgers, building competent communities and building communities that basically embed these skills within them are ways of stretching those dollars.
Absolutely.
Because it's becoming clearer and clearer, government just can't continue to fund at the level it's been funded.
Thank you. So I'm just gonna do this quickly, and then I want to spend 5 minutes, about 10 minutes for discussion of just some thoughts on tying these all together. But given that one of the themes throughout both programs, and certainly anywhere we're going to take these, is sort of the multicultural society, is that the evidence for cultural adaptation of these is there's limited evidence for the effectiveness of evidence-based programs with ethnic minority youth and families, but there's also limited evidence that they're less effective, okay? There are strong opinions, but limited evidence. Cultural adaptations potentially actually compromise fidelity and effectiveness. So in the Strengthening Families program in Hawaii, they did cultural adaptations, and the bottom line was, I think maybe 4 sites, in some sites for some groups, it made no difference, but in some it was less effective. It increased engagement, so we have to separate those. What was less effective, and possibly because they're compromising some of the core components. And there's no limit to the variance of clinical problems in cultural groups and communities. We just saw with the Aboriginal, all the adaptations we would need in Australia. What about New Zealand minority? What about, Southwest, First Nations, in the U.S. versus Minnesota? So that we may need targeted adaptations when there's sort of a distinct socio-cultural context of risk or resilience. Certainly, Aboriginal populations is one in terms of their historical legacy, but we also know if they're enculturated in a Native American or First Nations culture, strongly identifying the strengths, perhaps, grandparent relationships. I think that was a really important part that can also be protective. For example, there are still some studies of protection against alcohol use. And there may be discrete sociocultural symptom presentation in some groups, like the high risk of depression and suicide, I believe, in Puerto Rican girls, I think it is in the book. There are access and equity issues about who we're including in these studies, in the research effectiveness studies. And some of this is adapted from Alan Kasdan. I think here's a really good article. But social validity, and that comes to the acceptability when implemented in these communities. So that was before we wanted to evaluate outcomes. Is this acceptable in this community? Culturally responsive engagement, I think, is a huge piece. Targeting distinctive sociocultural fit, which might be parenting beliefs, the way children's mental health problems present. I mean, some cultures don't have a concept of mental health. Which doesn't mean that ours is right. Community attitudes for evidence-based practices, of course. And not only including sociocultural community relevant examples and acknowledging and respecting, and I don't like culturally sensitive as a term. I think we need to be more than sensitive. I think we have to be really responsive. But I think we need to actually partner with the community. So kudos to the Community Collaborative Board that I had the privilege of sitting in on, in adapting, developing, and evaluating these interventions. And I think that also speaks to sustainability, not just including these folks in research as participants. So, all right, so we've sort of looked at a couple of these things. So I'm going to give you my 5-minute future maybe opinion. They looked really similar in a lot of ways, incredible years and entropy. The findings were really similar across different populations in a number of ways. If we look, and I don't have them all listed, at just a number of the parenting programs that work, evidence for their efficacy and their effectiveness, okay? They're different and the same. Triple P has different levels. It's a population health, I've said, from universal prevention to targeted high-risk families. In 2 weeks, I'm going to talk about SNAP, which is a gender-specific parenting program, so I'll come back to this one. But before brand names, anyone know this man? Yay! Jerry Patterson. To me, he's the father of evidence-based parenting, right? He's like Freud is to psychoanalysis, Skinner is to behavior modification. So before brand names, it was behavioral parent training. Before then, we even did these single subject studies to look at timeout. Should it be 10 minutes, 15, 5 minutes? Commands. Rex Foreman did incredible work on how parents of aggressive kids give too many commands. I won't get into the technical. I had the good fortune to work with Jerry Patterson in Oregon for a year, and all of the people who are the developers of these other approaches would come and study with them. Before it was a brand name, before it was Triple P, before it was Incredible Years, before it was all these different things. There were other people, Connie Hanf, because she's a woman, so I have to mention her, okay? So what do they have in common? They all focus on strengthening parenting skills, modifying coercive family interactions. They all target risk and protective factors. They all foster child social and academic. They all rely on scientifically validated theories. And interventions are rigorously evaluated. They're all ecological. And programs should address parenting in everyday contexts, not some, your question, Diane, was great about the role plays, not some sort of hypothetical situations. Be developmentally appropriate, culturally responsive, and gender sensitive. And Amy, I'd love to hear your opinion on this. So if we look at the meta-analysis across these programs, these are the components that have the large effects. Teaching parents to use timeout as child externalizing behavioral. So practicing skills with child during sessions or performance-based role play is a proxy when you're not doing a family session with child. A lot of the ancillary services that get added on decrease program effectiveness. Okay. So Bruce Torpeda has developed in child mental health what are some of the core components for children's mental health. This is his slide that I adapted and added some others for parenting. But if we look at parent training and look at a number of the programs, and I don't know if you can actually see on the white, but commands, compliance, rewards, they're the practice elements that are common across these. Okay, can you see the white? I just realized now it's not. So take my word, praise, commands. Here, I just copied this out of 2 different articles, one on Incredible Years, one on Triple P. The way he got his common elements was by coding these articles, but you can see the overlap, and it may be different because the article may have been with different age kids or different population. But behavioral parent trainers have done this way before Torpeda ever did this, and the systematic review shows the same thing. So I think putting it all together, because I think this speaks not just to sustainability of, I think these evidence-based programs are great. The Triple P, the Incredible Years, agencies can afford them, that adapt in communities, that's fine. I mean, Triple P is being used on a population level in Glasgow with full government support and funding, fabulous. But what about other agencies, okay? Is understanding some of the theoretical foundations. We can teach that to our students in graduate school, okay? Understanding the interventions and the parenting skills training, okay? There's not a whole lot there, okay? And then wrapping it in the clinical skills and therapy process that we learn, engaging parents, setting goals. So this is about their goals and tailoring it. How to structure sessions so that you're not cutting out role play because A, of time, which was a theme, but B, because you aren't comfortable and time filled up. But how do you do that process of teaching that's not teaching at people? Like, I'm just going to do okay, the collaborative empowering, how do you address the contextual factors? So that's all the clinical skills that we bring our clinical decision-making selves to, rather than here's a program and here's a manual. And then the supervision and support to do it. So again, Peter and I started having this discussion about the common elements and where McSilver's going with it a little bit. And I don't know if this is the future of parenting, but I think this is a complement, it complements and is an alternative to the packages. So we have about 8 minutes. So you've listened to me talk for a long time. See, I actually usually do role plays when I teach. But it's kind of a program of research and studies. We have some others, so I'm just wondering if we can take the last 7 minutes or whatever and get a little feedback or any questions. Or you've sat too long and please, please.
So I
Thank you for
totally,
coming.
of course, I'm sorry, I'm stepping in something. I completely agree about the common elements in behavioral parent training programs, and I think you can say the same thing about lots of other packaged interventions for lots of things. And the long conversations I've had with Matt Sanders about some of this stuff, and last with Carolyn's group that we got, but the challenge is that even if everybody knows what the common elements are, if there isn't some structure that requires adherence, people end up saying, I'm doing the empirically supported thing. Not everyone, but a lot of people will say they're doing the empirically supported thing and will be doing the comfortable thing, which is what you're saying about, well, I know those, but it's just, she wanted to chat and I wanted to chat, and so we spent the session chatting and we're both very happy with it. And then it doesn't end up having the same impact. And trying to figure out a way to get people to do the steps that they really need to do
Yes.
to have the impact they need to have without having there be a formal structure there that requires it of them is a challenge. But I agree that those common elements are certainly what underlies all of the effectiveness.
And I not only think it's a great point, but that you do need a structure. It just may not be the manual.
Right.
And again, McSilver's working on PEDS practitioner education, decision-making tools. So you certainly need a map to go how you go through it, or modules. I'm not talking about eclectic. I'm not just talking about
Right.
So yes, and I would love off the record, because we're taping, to discuss some of those discussions with Matt Sanders. So Amy and I go back a ways also. But yes, you do need some structure and some way to track adherence to what are the strategies you're using, what are you implementing, is the family changing? If not, let's look at what's doing. There absolutely need ways to track that in some structure. So in no ways do I want to be tossing out these programs, but I think we need to start looking at, to the extent we know, we don't always know, but to the extent we know, what are really the evidence-supported components, what we must be doing, versus where are we adapting and modifying and using clinical decision-making. That's a great point. Thank you. Yes.
I'm interested in how kind of public health models can be applied to mental health, and I was just wondering, from your perspective, how it seems like this is kind of fitting into that realm, and how you see that fitting in, and what other efforts can be made to really make this more of a public health kind of effort.
So again, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you a quick answer using Triple P as an illustration, but you're here, so it's a conversation. I don't have answers to it, so it's definitely a conversation. But what Triple P has is levels. So at the first level, universal prevention includes media programs. It includes their posters on buses. At one point, they did a study with North and South New Zealand as a comparison. There have been some evaluations of media programs and television programs, both in Australia, but now in Oregon, Harold and also, okay. We're going to do one, I think, in Ontario, maybe a web-based one, because there are some parents who are doing, lots of parents doing a really good job, but they're the ones who are asking the pediatrician or their best friend about everyday kind of challenging childhood stuff or advice and stuff that maybe don't need the role play, the practice, versus some of the more clinically distressed families. So that's a different level. Then there's another level that's brief parenting groups with Sometimes they're just around topics. They may be with phone call support, have some videos. They've also done self-watching of the videos with consultation, with telephone input, particularly if we start looking at places like rural communities. I mean, there are folks who don't have parenting groups in their community, who don't have access. Same thing in child mental health, telepsychiatry. That it's a new world that you'll know a lot more about than I do, because I'm a little bit of an old fogey. But in terms of technology, but then there's another level, which is the full parenting group. And then there's another level, which is the full parenting group with couples communication training for distressed couples or with stress management, so targeting particular populations. And then they're sitting down with the families. There are families, there always will be, that we need to see clinically in their home, in their office, the community center, but that need a lot of individual support and help. So it's really, how do we offer those services and how do we triage? And what they do is they let families self-select. They may enter at one level. So it's a minimal sufficiency principle, which might really fit well as Peter's raising the issue of minimal resources and getting tired of selecting at what level you go in. The other thing, and I don't know if this is true or not, just like in medicine, we now go on the web and we look things up when we talk to our doctors. Not everyone, but more and more folks. A lot of websites are not very reliable, but I'm betting that you're all going to go to PubMed or NMH or the Mayo Clinic, and you're not going to see what the guy down the street says, but is really more and more, as we do parent empowerment, having informed consumers. And who ask questions and know where to look. And I think that's part of our ethical practice in terms of evidence-based practice, not having these practices and this information, but how we become transparent and share it. But certainly parents of children with mental illness, the Alliance in the States is a strong advocacy and empowerment. I see more evidence of that occurring. I'd love to see even more. Again, I haven't worked in the States in 10 years, so you'll have a better sense of what's happening here. And youth engagement involved with the same thing, and more input and selection. So, any last?
I would say, as a parent, partner, family advocate, it depends on who you talk to, it's interchangeable, but having worked in the community at a parent resource center that has parents of children who have children that are diagnosed with mental health disorders, 12 and a half years working, under the umbrella of the Mental Health Association of New York City, we worked with parents who had children that are diagnosed, and so we give those parents a lot of support, information, referrals, and because we have lived experiences, we have, been able to do that. And having done some parenting programs, we did STEP, that's very old. I don't know if you can remember that. STEP, and then the Maryland Steele Strengthening Multiple Family curriculum, and some others as well. And so I think it's important also, and as you alluded to, here in the States, we do have an array, of course, New York State and in New York City, we have youth advocates and we have parent advocates as well. We have 9 they're now called family resource centers. And so, I would love to sit down and talk to you more about, the things that are happening here in the city, and I can bring in my colleagues as well, so.
I'm here.
But I enjoyed the talk, and I hadn't heard of the Triple P, but the incredible years I just heard.
So if I could build on what you said as a closing comment, and then I'm happy to stay, but I don't want to keep people, it's a lunch and learn. And the reason I'm really emphasizing evidence-based is there are lots of parenting groups out there that aren't. And we want to bridge that gap and get parents and kids the best knowledge we have, even with its limits and even with its problems and questions of sustainability. In our international survey, we put the name of something that sounded like a parenting group, but wasn't, to test for the responses. And fortunately, very few, I think 4% of Canadian parents had heard of it and participated in it, so it didn't exist. But I want to build on what you said about lived experience. I think one of the shifts, and I think this is a shift in science, more so in some disciplines than others. It used to be quantitative, and that was the real science, and our randomized controlled trials were the gold standard, and qualitative folks had to really fight for their stuff, and they didn't get it funded, and again, there's still lots of problems there. But I think that there's just so much more recognition of that we need the voice of providers, of parents, of community folks, and that when I see some of these scientists who have 100 studies on their CVs, and they've been these RCT gold standards, I don't know when they compact, and they're now writing and opening, open to alternatives, and we begin to see things getting funded, at least with mixed methods. I think that is a way to both make these programs more relevant where they need to be adapted, but also more sustainable, because we really all learn from one another and sort of all empower one another, because it's all about the kids. And I started my career sitting with individual children in psychotherapy thinking, what the heck am I doing? Like, really, I'd sit there thinking, like, what am I going to say next? What is this hour doing with this child? It's just not, I mean, therapy relationship's important, but it's just not about us. It's about the families and communities and their experience. So thank you for your comment. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.